Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Lagasse. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's Rheumatology Patient Experience Breakout Session. I am thrilled to be here with two powerhouse patient advocates, Marissa Zeppieri and Christine von Raesfield. We had a little bit of time to prep for this session. There's so many topics that we could cover today, but for today's session, we're going to focus on condition management, self-advocacy as part of your care, and setting boundaries and managing expectations around our individual abilities living with autoimmune diseases. But before we get into our topics for today, I'm going to have my fellow panelists introduce themselves. Christine, let's start with you, please.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Christine von Raesfield. I am a patient advocate and CEO of a nonprofit called People with Empathy. We're geared towards breaking down those silos in healthcare through conversations. So I have been a patient my entire life, starting at the age of 5 with my first surgery, and then on to just multiple autoimmune conditions topped with rare disease as well. So I'm really just using the negative experiences that I've had to educate, empower the industry, and really bring that patient voice into focus. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christine. And Marissa.
My name is Marissa Zeppieri. Some of you already know me as Lupus Chick. I founded Lupus Chick. We're a nonprofit. I founded it back in 2007. I have been living with symptoms of lupus since the age of 8. I am a former journalist, and I just published the memoir, Chronically Fabulous, which is basically my 20 years after being diagnosed of everything I learned all in one book. So it's great to be here, and hopefully we can share some amazing tips with you today.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Like I said, my name is Anna Lagasse. I was diagnosed with systemic juvenile idiopathic arthritis almost 27 years ago, which is stranger and stranger to say every day. But what Christine said about taking negative things and turning them into more positive or positively influencing industry is something that really resonates with me, because what I like to talk about is taking 27 years, multiple comorbidities, 10 plus surgeries, and weaponizing my experience for good is how I always describe it, which is how I came to work with the Autoimmune Association. But yeah, so let's jump right in, because obviously we have a wealth of expertise between the three of us. So let's talk about condition management, which is a really big topic and can mean a lot of different things. But Marissa, let's start with you, because I know you had some thoughts on health journaling as part of condition management.
Absolutely. So health journaling is a topic that I talk about a lot on Lupus Chick, and it's really something that helped me from day one. And it's been able to show me so many different things, and people that I've talked to that take part in it are able to learn so much about their body. So health journaling is just basically writing everything down. Obviously, I love to write. I was a journalist, but we are writing down so that we could learn what triggers our body and our symptoms. And I remember when I was first diagnosed, I didn't hear the word trigger a lot. We're going back a couple of decades ago, but I think now it's just something that we hear a lot in our communities of. There's so many different triggers that we may not even think of that could exacerbate symptoms or bring on flare-ups. So when I started health journaling, I literally got a cheap notebook from like the dollar store, and every day I started writing down everything, even things that you might think are insignificant. What I ate, what I was drinking, medications that I was taking, supplements. For me, if I was in the sun, if there was a stressor in life, whether it was a physical stressor or maybe something emotional that you're going through, how much you're sleeping, are you napping? Really simple things. And also for women, are you near that time of the month? So these are all things that I never thought were eventually going to provide me with so much data, but I still have these journals today. And some things that I learned for living with lupus, 5 minutes in the sun is really one of my biggest triggers. So is stress. Right before my menstrual cycle, those 4 or 5 days before, my symptoms were out of control. and I would start to go into a flare every month. I didn't put two and two together, especially when I was first diagnosed. These are things that my physicians never told me to look out for. There was never a connection between the menstrual cycle and symptoms. But, you know, you look back on your journals and your data over time, and you can see really clear patterns of, okay, when I eat this, or when I'm in the sun, or when I'm crying, you know, or there I do something too physical, the next few days I have these symptoms. So I would definitely encourage you. You can start off maybe even just leaving notes on your cell phone if you don't want to write it down, or making a Google Doc, or just something to be able to track all of these different things. And I think you will find a plethora of data over time. At least give it 6 months, give it a good 6 month go.
That's really helpful. I'm such a nerd for data. So I love the idea of being able to longitudinally go back and really dig in and figure out what those individual triggers are. And I really don't think we talk enough when it comes to folks with uteruses about how much your menstrual cycle can really be a trigger of systemic inflammation. So I'm so glad that you brought that up today. Christine, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on condition management.
Sure. So with me, you know, I wasn't very good at the journaling, and I wish that I was. I had most of my medical records were lost. And so right now I'm really just trying to rebuild my medical history. And so notes now are very important. So Marissa, I applaud you for having all of that, because it's a lot of information to carry over years of diagnoses. For me, what really spurs my advocacy and everything is curiosity, and really just realizing, you know, I'm in the precision medicine space just by chance. You know, I'm entered into Stanford's human-wide program. I'm part of the All of Us research program. I'm in that 23andMe program that we're all in for, which started out with lupus research. But using those tools, I've been able to really hone in on my own care and really change my own treatments and the outcomes. So for me, it really is that curiosity of what is actually happening to me, instead of taking what people say. You know, I do have a diagnosis for lupus, and so a lot of things were dismissed after that diagnosis, and really just me pushing forward with my own curiosity of, this is still happening. And, you know, we all look great. That is a big thing that we all hear, is that nobody thinks that we're sick. So it's a little bit harder to then really explore some of the symptoms that you're experiencing and fight for something further. So really, I think just having that curiosity and knowing that there are potential things out there with precision medicine that can help us in our quest to have a better quality of life. Does that answer?
No, for sure. This is great. And, you know, I thought about what I wanted to talk about as it pertains to condition management, because as some folks who I can see the participants, and I'm so thrilled to see some names I know today. You know, there's so many different things that I'm passionate about that are very individual to how I, you know, manage my arthritis at this point in time. But something, and this is only something that I've done in, you know, recent years, something that's really been a game changer for me, and this is going to sound so silly, was finding a good PCP, finding a good primary care physician. Because to your point about sort of self-advocacy and having to push, when you're an army of one, it is so exhausting. And I think all of us have probably entered, you know, we've entered into this point where multiple diagnoses, multiple comorbidities, and it's just too big to manage. And I know that I was really guilty of trying to use my rheumatologist as my PCP for things like a sinus infection. And she was so great for so long about, sure, yep, I'll write you a script this time, Anna, but you really need to get a PCP. And what this has been incredibly helpful for me is I have 3 different orthopedic surgeons. So hips, knees, wrists, and hands. Obviously, I have my OBGYN, but I'm also seen by maternal and fetal medicine sort of preemptively as we're getting ready to have kids, because there's so many different things to manage, from genetic testing to can I stay on my meds, to the fact that as soon as you're 35, you're a geriatric pregnancy. And then, you know, all of us, I think, would be considered high risk on top of that. I also have recurrent pericarditis, so I have a cardiologist that I need to be followed with, and a dermatologist. and a GI at this point. And what I really found is I've moved away from just having one annual physical with my doctor, my PCP. We see each other twice a year, and she QBs so much of this for me. My annual echo, sneaking me in for certain appointments that I can't get, different tests that it's so hard to get into subspecialty care sometimes. I found it's really helpful to have your PCP as a conduit for all of that. And also just having somebody who can get to know you as a whole person, as a whole patient, and not just be so focused on one diagnosis, especially when we're talking about triggers, right? I think that some of our specialists are so focused on certain conditions, certain triggers, certain treatments, that it's hard for them to pull back and realize that just because you have this diagnosis or that diagnosis, that it might not always be attributed to that. There could be something else underlying that's going on. There could be something else that we haven't even considered. So it sounds like such a simple thing, but really finding a PCP who gets my treatment goals, sees me as a whole person, and is willing to advocate for me even within the health system that I get my treatment in, has been hugely, hugely game changing for me.
Can I comment on that as well?
Please do.
So for me, I have 15 plus specialists. I'm a heart failure patient in addition to other rare and genetic conditions. And for me, it has been difficult to manage my care. I'm with an amazing hospital system, but also I'm lacking a primary care physician who really understands the number of conditions that I'm in. So while we like to say that a primary is our key, there is a difficult time for those of us who face multiple conditions in actually finding a regular PCP that is going to understand where to even refer you. So I think, right now I'm in a period of undiagnosed again. And I really think one of the issues that we need to look at is to really, fix that relationship between physicians and patients and the communication there. I've been lucky enough to really become friends and have my own physicians as mentors. But most people don't have that opportunity. So really, how do you build a good relationship with your physicians in the 15 minutes of time that you have to see him, but also at the same time as an advocate, using that 15 minutes wisely and making sure that all of your physicians are looking at you holistically. I've come across conversations with other advocates, with other physicians where things haven't seemed right and I've pushed for something else and then found out other things. So not all of our physicians are so overwhelmed. We have to also realize, there's a big part of us in that needs to be a part of this system as well. And Marissa, I don't know if Marissa has any comments, but if anyone knows a good PCP that can handle multiple illnesses, call me.
I do have a quick comment. I do think that it's definitely trial and error when we try out new doctors. And I think in time, we have to become comfortable with the fact that we might have to try yet another one. And we might have to fire a doctor if it comes down to it, if there's just not a good match, and that happens. I think, I got really lucky when I moved back up north, asking people, do you have a really compassionate, empathetic doctor that works with people that have multiple conditions? And I was able to find one. And as you were saying, Christine, how you have such a short amount of time, I love the fact that I can actually, he knows me so well at this point that when I go there and I say, I don't think that this is lupus, and these are some possible blood tests. I would really, really like it if you can run those for me. He's like, I actually appreciate that you bring this stuff because it moves our appointment quicker. Now, we know not all physicians will take that stance. But like I said, it's just going there and, I think becoming comfortable with advocating and just sticking up for yourself. And, and I've had to say, not everything goes back to lupus. If my eyeball is falling out or I have a paper cut, it's originally well, it's got to be the lupus. It's got to be the lupus. No, there's been times when it's actually not the lupus. So I hate that we kind of fall under these umbrellas over time where they link everything back. And this is why, again, like, you have to be okay speaking up. And, I've had to tell doctors, like, I really don't think you're listening to me right now. So I'd like to just kind of go over this with you one more time so that we can come up with a solution. And I think at that point they realize, okay, this person is going to advocate for themselves, and they're not going to leave here until we come up with a solution.
That's so important, and it's perfect, because something that we had talked about before this panel as a topic at large is this concept of self-advocacy, which we've already touched on a little bit. So, and I want to continue to dig in. So, something that I would offer up that has become really important from an advocacy standpoint in my care lately is, now that laws have changed and our data and our clinic notes have to be completely available to us almost instantaneously at this point. My practice now is I'll usually wait a day or two, because sometimes there is a little lag in closing the chart, right? But I go back and I check the appointment notes from every appointment I have, and I can't believe recently the gap in what we talked about and what gets charted. So very recently, with my GI, I had tested positive for this infection. We've been trying to treat it. Shocking, autoimmune, it's antibiotic resistant in me, and it's become really complex and really life-changing for me at this point. And I went back in and I was looking at the appointment notes. I didn't feel good about how the appointment went in general, but it was a virtual visit, and it was just, a little bit different than when you're sitting in a room, as valuable as telehealth has been this past year and a half. But in any event, I went back and I looked at the clinic notes, and I realized that she snuck an IBS diagnosis in there. We never talked about that. And I think all of us know that the way, or maybe not all of us, but folks who have GI diagnoses know that IBS, it's sort of like fibromyalgia. There are a lot of doctors out there that see that, and it sticks in their mind, and they have chosen to believe that it's purely psychological and that there isn't really any way to treat it. And I think that this is especially true of women. And I couldn't believe that she would put something in my chart, that she would basically pop a little diagnosis in there real quick without saying anything to me. And I was able to email her and say, listen, we didn't talk about this at all. And if you're treating me for this without clearing this infection first, I think the relationship we have is over at this point, because to me, it feels like you've given up on treating this infection. You're filing it under IBS, sending me off to a dietitian, and you've more or less given up on me. And it was a really challenging conversation to have. But had I not gone back and checked those clinic notes and saw what she had charted from our encounter, I would have missed it completely and would have lost, another several months waiting for my next 3-month follow-up to realize that we really are not on the same page at this point. So I was trying to think of something really tangible as like a tip that I could give folks for self-advocacy. So always checking your appointment notes after the fact is what I have to offer. I'd love to hear some like really tangible tips and tricks from you guys as well.
So I'm in complete agreement with you on checking your records. Mine, I just recently went back through, and I've been seeing the same doctors forever, and they had me listed as a white woman where I am half Asian. So to me, that's important when they're looking at clinical trials and other options for me. So even making sure that your race and your marital status are correct. I had a friend visit me, and someone listed him as my husband, which makes people think I have a whole different support system than I already have. So even just those general basics. But what I really wanted to say is, know your options, do your research, and be out there and take an active role in your disease. I think a lot of us as patients, we wait for a diagnosis, and then when we get that diagnosis, we just look at what's there and we take everybody's opinions, and we're not really looking at ourselves. And I didn't grow up with a lot of support in the healthcare side of it, aside from the physicians that really took an interest in me. But, one of the things that they always taught me is to really speak out. And I've had instances, I've had 3 joint replacements. I deal with toxic encephalopathy. Some of my night vision has been lost, and those are medications. But when I went in to talk about these issues, I was told that, oh, it was either related to my lupus or go see a psychiatrist. And so actually, it has been helpful actually having a psychiatrist who has been able to go back to medical physicians and tell them that this is not a psychiatric issue. And so I think, that's one of the other things is establishing these relationships with your physicians, really keeping your appointments quick, be mindful of their time, and also come to them with what you think are possible solutions or what you're dealing with. I think it needs to be a mutual collaboration between you and your physicians. And I hear a lot of times people say that they don't want to complain because they don't want it listed in their charts, or they won't get good care if they start to complain. And I want people to know that is the absolute, that's a lie. I was able to leave a hospital system that actually told me to leave the hospital system because they could no longer help me. So don't wait for someone else to tell you you need help somewhere else. Really just be proactive in your own care.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that. And I mentioned it before, but I think, in addition to just speaking up and speaking out for yourself, having a lot of the work done before the appointment. And of course, it falls on us and it makes life more challenging because we're exhausted and dealing with so many other things. But, looking at your symptoms, I always try to make a list because those appointments go very quickly. Once you start talking about something, it might start spiraling into 3 or 4 other things. And then you leave and you get in your car and you realize I didn't even discuss those 2 other things that were really important. So having a list of items, and I usually will let them know up front. I'll be like, towards the middle or end of our appointment, I'd really like to go over a couple of things with you. And again, doing your research beforehand. So if you're dealing with certain symptoms or having issues, think about research. What could this possibly be? What are some treatment options? I've asked my doctor about certain medications that aren't necessarily for lupus or are off label, but have you ever had any success with them? Have you ever tried them with other people? I think just going in there sort of armed and advocating for yourself, but in a kind way, because I do believe that, you get a lot more with kindness, but also being very firm and very direct. I really don't have a lot of filters, so they know that I'm going to be a straight shooter when I go in there. And I think they actually appreciate that because it keeps that appointment moving. They know exactly what you're looking for. And also, advocating for yourself in a way of, if you have to see a new specialist and they're telling you it's a 6-month wait, don't be shy to call that clinic a couple of days a week and say, hi, it's Marissa, 9:30 in the morning. Has anyone by any chance canceled? Because the likelihood of them remembering that you're waiting for a canceled appointment or checking their list is probably not going to happen. So either you're going to grab a canceled appointment, or they're going to realize this person's not giving up. They really don't feel well. They're in a flare. They need to get in here, and you're going to stick out in their mind. So I think just little things like that to sort of make these appointments easier and in our favor, really.
And Marissa, I want to add really quick to that on the appointments. Really be mindful of your approach with your physician. Don't come in angry. They're also questioning what's happening and don't realize. So be very mindful of your approach when you're coming to them, and kindness is always helpful. But also come with data. If you want to try something out, if you've heard things in the communities, come to them with other studies and resources that prove that, so that you're not wasting their time with maybe some fish oil or something that you heard about online, but really come prepared with facts. And I would also say, utilize the patient portal. I send messages to my physician all the time saying, these are my concerns. We need to address that. And then I list my top concerns before any appointment. So when we go into it, he says, or she says in the beginning, okay, I saw your list of things. These aren't important, but this is. And really just forming that together, but also learning really how to explain your own symptoms. You know, I see a lot of patients having trouble with this when they go into their physicians, and I've talked to physicians as well who say, well, they just say that they're tired, you know, or they don't know how to explain the severity of their symptoms. So really also learning how to interpret what you're going through in a way that your physician will understand the level of your severity. So if you're tired, just saying you're tired doesn't really do anything, but saying, you know, the last 5 days I've been so exhausted, I can't even lift my pinky, you know, or something that puts it into a frame where they can actually see and relate to you on that, because your level of tired or your level of pain is going to be completely different from anyone else that walks into that office. So really being clear on the symptoms you're experiencing, the way you're experiencing them, and then also, you know, your own thoughts on that. So really combining that, but in a way that you make the most of that 15 minutes, if that's all you have.
Can I jump in there real quick? Because you mentioned something that's so critical. You know, there's going to be some people here listening that eventually a doctor or someone is going to suggest that you might want to apply for disability. Let's just throw that out there. And whether you are or not, this is just a great thing to keep in mind. Christine just mentioned it. When you go through that process, and I'm sure you've talked to people, and it is a long, arduous process, there needs to be so many specifics. So when a doctor has to fill out, like, what is this person able to do on a daily basis? Well, they're very tired. That's very vague. But if you can go in and tell your physician, I had to call out of work 3 times this week. I was unable to cook dinner for my children. I slept an average of 14 hours a day for the past 4 days. I was unable to shower 4 out of the last 5 days. These are really specific things. And when you're bringing them up, when you're putting them in your chart online and you're sending messages and you have these in detail in electronic form, these are the things that you want when they're able to gauge, okay, your activities of daily living are suffering. You know, you might need to get extra help. They might have programs that can have someone come in and help you. But you're, you know, by just going in and saying like, well, I just feel really tired, or I'm just not able to do as much as I used to, try to be as specific as possible.
And I think an important thing for us to think about, especially as lupus or autoimmune patients who really don't have a lot of answers, is that, you know, unfortunately, we probably won't have a cure for anything that we're going through in our lifetimes. But in the meantime, we can have a good quality of life. So you really have to be vigilant about that quality of life that you want to keep. You know, if you are having difficulty walking upstairs, you know, I was on a panel the other day where they were discussing pain and function together, and not realizing that there are a lot of us that live in constant pain, and we have learned to compartmentalize that. So my pain level in an 8 could be someone else's pain level of 1,000, you know, and so really those differences in what you're going through really need to be, you know, stated.
This is such a rich conversation. I feel like we could continue down this path for another hour, but I wanna pivot a little bit towards something that I think is really important. So we've talked a lot about managing our condition and advocacy within the scope of receiving our care with our providers. And so I'd love to hear from both of you. You know, some of the things that you've said, you know, Marissa, you mentioned, you know, we're exhausted, we're managing a million different things. And Christine, you mentioned this ability to articulate with, you know, a high level of specificity our symptoms and how they're affecting us. And obviously that's really important in the scope of our clinical care, but we also live lives outside of our clinical encounters, right? And I'd love to hear from both of you. This is a topic that has really been weighing on me a lot lately. And I know, and I'm sure the both of you have heard this, I hear it so frequently in the patient community, just feeling like they have a lack of support in their support system. And I've always felt like I've had a really, really great support system. But even 27 years in, I'm realizing that I need to continue to sort of restate my needs or ask for help that I didn't used to need, or especially living in COVID times as somebody who's high risk, manage folks' expectations as far as what I can and can't do right now. So I'd really love to hear from you guys as far as in your personal lives, whether it's with family or friends, partners, loved ones, coworkers, pets, whomever is important to you in your orbit. How do you manage sort of your boundaries and expectation settings as far as, you know, getting folks to understand not just what you're going through, but what you need or don't need from them on any given day?
Well, do you want to go first, Marissa?
Okay. So, you know, I've talked with people for years how I think therapists and counselors can be such a crucial part of our support system, right? Not only to be able to have someone to speak to freely that's neutral and non-judgmental, but also has really helped me set very clear boundaries. And there's a couple of things about boundaries. You know, we have to accept the fact that not everyone in our life is going to understand our illness. They're not going to want to understand. They're not going to educate themselves. That is just the reality, and we have to accept that as fact and really put our energy and our focus on the people that do try to understand and are compassionate, are empathetic. And we have to be okay with setting boundaries for ourselves and understanding that we are on limited time, limited energy, and we have to do the things that are most important with the time and, you know, that we're given every day, that we actually feel, you know, halfway decent, that we can get some things done. And not everyone's going to like when you start setting boundaries for yourself either, I think is something really to keep in mind. And that's okay. That is not your problem at the end of the day. But again, I think doing things with kindness. And I always like to ask myself, am I being clear? Am I being clear with the people in my life, in my household, my spouse, my family, my mom, my friends? So now I really try to lay it out instead of just saying, I really don't feel good today, I'm having a hard day. You know, I didn't sleep well last night. I have a fever. I have zero energy. If you can maybe grab me lunch or just go and grab the groceries or just take the dog out for me this morning and let me sleep, that could actually help my day go so much better. You know, if I can get a nap in, I'll be able to handle the rest of the day. But I have to be very specific with my requests. And it also really helps my family and my loved ones help me out. I think if you're a caregiver, you know, or someone in that type of role, instead of saying like, let me know if you need anything, a very specific offer of, hey, how about Thursday or Friday, I drop you off some dinner, or let me know what you need in the grocery store this week, because when I go, I'd like to do your shopping as well. Or let me take the kids for you one night so you can, you know, sleep or get a nap in. So I think just always go back to being specific, being clear, and I'm trying to think what else. I think those for me are really some of the biggest things. And also, you know, if I say I'm going to take a trip with, you know, a family member or a friend, I let people know beforehand. Traveling, I love to travel. I would do it every day if I could. But it's also really hard on my body. So I always try to go a day earlier. I try to make sure when I am there, wherever we're going, I have rest days, and maybe every other day or every 2 days that I know that's a day when there's nothing. They can still go and do whatever they want on those days, but I am not getting out of bed. And you have to be okay with that before we go, because that's my hard boundary line. So I think, you know, keeping things like that in mind and letting people know beforehand so they can make a choice. Okay, does this work for me? Do I want to get involved in this? That way there's no confusion when things actually happen, and no one's pressuring someone or making someone feel bad. You know, boundaries sort of trickle into every single area of our life. So
I love your point about being specific, though. I think I have this tendency, and I really had to check myself on it lately, where in the same way that I don't want to be a high maintenance patient with my doctor sometimes, I didn't even really realize I did this as much until I went to therapy. This idea of I am a burden on those around me. Nobody in my life has ever made me feel burdensome. I have completely internalized this message. And as a result, there have been a lot of times where I have been completely drowning, on the verge of just, you know, running headfirst into a flare. But I didn't know how to stop and ask for help. Even 20 plus years in, this is so hard for me. And so very recently, it's such a silly thing, but I had to say to my partner, listen, on infusion days, I need you home at 5 o'clock on the dot, as much as is possible. I need you to take the dog out. I need you to make dinner. I need you to make sure I drink a ton of water. And then tomorrow morning, I need you to get up with the dog. I need you to make breakfast, and I need you to go get groceries. And he is such a willing partner. We have as close to 50-50 in a household as anybody can. And I'm so proud of that. But I still have to say with specificity, on this day, this is what I need. Because otherwise, I think for a long time, I was just hoping that he would intuit that he should come home early and, make sure we had a nice dinner or take the dog out. Because, 6 years into the treatment that I'm on, I had actually never just asked for that. And so I think that being specific is so important, but also understanding that even if you are a veteran patient, that your needs are going to continue to change. Your boundaries are going to continue to change. Things that you're previously comfortable with or feel like you didn't need help with are going to change. I know that we're sort of coming to the end of our time, so I wanted to give Christine an opportunity.
Yeah. Totally. So I relate with you on the burden feeling. So I went out on permanent disability at the age of 27. I'm 46 now. So I have been out for a while, and really just not being able to have a job and really not having a spouse or huge support system was difficult. I didn't have a hard time getting on disability. I got on the first time. But what I realized too is a lot of these things, we count on support, but we're also not looking towards ourselves. And when I've been in the industry and when I've talked to other people, what I do find is a lot of the people that are huge, amazing advocates have not had the support system that really enabled them to be sick. And I think a lot of times we surround ourselves with people who we think are supporting us, but really they could be holding us back. And so for me personally, it was a huge thing. I had to cut off toxic family members, because I don't look sick, and we didn't have that exposure to what I had really gone through when we were growing up. And so I think really when you're looking at support, you need to find people. I found that my biggest supporters are people who have been through the same type of experiences as me, and really just forming a group and a community of people who understand that. There was a thread in the chats here on Whova about support groups and people feeling like they don't have support and flaking on issues and stuff like that. I like to tell everybody that I know, my situation. You have your own. If you feel good, you call me, we'll go out. If you don't, we'll sit at home, and it's those types of people that we need to surround ourselves with, people who are also going through those things. And therapists, essential part in really even just letting go of the anger that you feel being a burden or being sick. And also, I wasn't very nice to my parents. I several times told them, this is your fault, because you gave me this. And so really, I think being cognizant of how we even interact with those people who are there to support us. But again, I've had trouble. I still have trouble. I'm still trying to figure out how to make this work, but I'm finding that cutting out the negative, toxic people in my life and really surrounding myself with people who know and understand, or at least are willing to understand what I'm going through, is more of what I needed. And I don't read minds. So if somebody doesn't tell me something that's going on, that's your bad. You should have told me at that time. And I would expect, I have honest relationships with the people in my life, and I would encourage everyone to find those support people outside of your family and outside of the people that are really just telling you that everything's going to be okay, but focusing on the people that have been to the bottom and said, you know what, I was there. It's totally okay because of this, but not just that passive aggressive, like that look in their eyes when you tell someone you're sick and they're just like, oh, to get away from that. So anyway, those are my thoughts on support.
Well, they're great. And what a powerful way to end, because I hope that something that everybody takes away from today in these breakout sessions is a sense of community, and knowing that you're not alone. There are folks out there that can empathize with your experience. And to the extent that you're able, find a way to connect with them, because we're all the better for it. We are just at time, which I am so proud of. We played Thank you both. I can't believe 27 years in, I can still learn. I've learned so much from the both of you. This has been an absolute pleasure, and I hope that we get to do this in person someday in the future. Thank you so much.
I'm Wendy. I'm a physician assistant in rheumatology for 24 years. And I thank you so much for allowing me to be here today as part of the Rheumatology Breakout. This is the Rheumatology Breakout session on clinical trials and drug development. Today, we will be covering clinical trials 101, exciting research happening in the autoimmune rheumatology space. And you'll also get to hear from patient advocate Kelly Owens on her personal experience in a clinical trial. Let's talk about today what are clinical trials, research trials. Research studies are performed by physicians and other health professionals in which new treatments are tested on volunteers. And studies are performed in people that it's aimed at evaluating a medical, surgical, or a behavioral intervention. This is the primary means that researchers can find out if a new treatment, like a new drug, a diet or medical device, is safe and effective in people. And they can learn if a new treatment is more effective and or has had less harmful side effects than the standard treatment that you might be on already for your arthritis or autoimmune disease. Other clinical trials test ways to find diseases early, sometimes before there's symptoms. Some test ways to prevent a health problem. Clinical trials may evaluate how to make life better for people living with a life-threatening disease or a chronic health problem. Safety is also always a concern in clinical trials. Prior to the study, an institutional review board referred to as the IRB must prove safety of the proposed study. The IRB oversees the study to make sure that all federal regulations protecting human volunteers are followed. In the clinical trials, patients are given a new medication and monitored closely for side effects and safety. And that's primarily what clinical research trials are, is evaluating effects and safety in the medications. The clinical trials may be controlled with a patient taking the study drug compared to patients taking another medication or a placebo. The clinical trials may also be what's called double blind. Neither the study personnel nor the patients know which treatment is given. Patients are fully informed of all the risks, the potential improvement in symptoms. An alternative treatment also could be available before enrolling into the study. The patients may ask questions or discuss the participation with the study personnel, and they also sign an informed consent prior to starting any of the procedures. There we'll go into the 4 phases of the clinical trials. The 4 phases, the clinical trials advance through 4 stages to test a treatment, find an appropriate dosage, observe side effects, and then after 3 doses or 3 phases, the drug or the intervention is found safe, then the FDA approves for clinical use and continues to monitor for the effects. The clinical trials of the drug are based on the phase. Phase 1 ensures that the treatment is safe in humans, usually a small group, around 20 to 80 participants, to evaluate the safety, the side effects, the dosage, and determine how and where it distributes within the body. Next, they move into the phase 2 trials. And this determines the right dosage and effectiveness in treating that particular disease. Around 100 to 300 people, this phase may last several years. Phase 3, we very often find these in our clinical rheumatology offices, determining whether the treatment would be safe and effective for a wide and diverse group of people, this leading to be several hundred to 3,000. And then if the FDA agrees that the trial results are positive, then it's going to approve the experimental drug or device. When we get into the phase 4, which is after FDA approval, This monitors public safety and then any potential serious adverse events in a large, diverse population and be able to evaluate the side effect over years. Next. Who would consider a clinical trial? Well, anyone with an autoimmune disease can be studied, anyone that meets eligibility criteria in the study protocol. Some studies also may be dependent on medications that that patient is already taking or their level of disease activity. It might also exclude some patients with other illnesses that might adversely affect their health or interfere with the accurate assessment of the study medicine safely. Anybody that wants to participate as a healthy subject. Also recommendation of a rheumatologist. And that's really where I think a lot of these autoimmune and rheumatology tests, clinical trials start, is in the practice. Next. Why would we consider a clinical trial? Well, first and foremost, it's going to contribute to the advancement of the medical knowledge and make a difference in the care of future patients by providing information about the benefits and risks of therapeutic, preventative, or diagnostic products or interventions. Many of these trials, our diseases have no cures, so these trials are enabling us to advance our knowledge for everyone to continue being able to have access to better medication. The participation might provide that patient with direct medical benefits. The risk of the patient's disease that they already have and the progression of that disease or their routine medical care that they're already getting might be greater than the risk of participation in the trial. So a lot of benefit for the patient. The clinical trials also provide basis for development and marketing of new drugs, biological products, medical devices. There's access for the patient to new, potentially more effective medicine, and they can get that before it's out there for the general public. And also, it enables the patients to have a more active role in their healthcare. The treatments are often free, including medicines being evaluated, doctor's visits, the physical exams, laboratory testing. Also, the patient has more longer comprehensive visits, a lot of people talking with them on the study team, more direct attention. And they also might get information on support groups and resources as well. There are some common myths as we go to the next slide. There's common myths of clinical research trials. And one of the myths is that clinical trials are not effective. And this isn't so. There's actually an impressive rate of success of clinical trials compared to the prevalence of the disease. And the trials can determine if side effects shown in that trial outweigh the benefits of the treatment. Also, the FDA approval takes 6 years, so there's plenty of time studying the effectiveness of the medication, and then the patient has earlier access to the treatment. These patients are prioritized and they receive higher quality of care. So clinical trials are effective. The myth number 2 that I chose is that if you start a trial, you need to participate through its entirety. That could be scary for a patient, and that's just not so. Prior to trial, the patients actually sign, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, an informed consent. That's really known as the patient's rights. There's benefits and risks associated with the trial treatment and the standard treatment, and logistics of participation are outlined. The value of the collected data is also very important as well in these trials. The researchers cannot ethically or medically force the patient to participate, and that patient actually may withdraw. The third myth, that a placebo would be given and adequate care would not be received for that patient. And again, all participants receive the same high quality and health as prioritized by that physician, the study team. Studies are highly regulated, as we mentioned earlier, by the IRB. Patients have rights, they're regulated, protocols followed more closely with monitoring visits and tentative care. And any decisions to use placebo in a clinical trial is really going to depend on how serious the illness is, or whether existing treatments available or other considerations that would ensure a high standard of ethics. Patients with a serious disease, the standard of care best available treatment will be used instead of placebo. And finally, the fourth myth that I chose is that clinical trials are expensive and not covered by insurance. And really, if we look at the research costs are actually separated from patient care costs. In that research study, the trial, that includes the trial, the data, the management, research physician, the study team, the analysis of the data, collection of the data, the test performed, that's usually all covered by the sponsored biopharmaceutical company. Now, the patient care costs that wouldn't be covered by the sponsor would be those costs that if you weren't in the study, if you had other unrelated doctor visits or labs, hospitalizations not related to the study. So I would definitely encourage check with the clinical research team and the insurance carrier about that coverage as well. So patients, again, emphasizing that they need to realize that they really get attention, costs are covered, very much more detailed visits. I know that some patients have talked about having that very quick visit. Maybe they don't have everything that they're able to talk about in that visit, but within these research trial visits, there's a lot of active participation. A protocol is followed, and some patients will actually get paid, reimbursed to be in that trial, also their travel as well. So we'll move on to look a little bit in the next slide, some exciting clinical research in autoimmune diseases. There's certainly a lot out there as well. First of all, I wanted to start with rheumatoid arthritis. I know earlier on in a slide I mentioned that there's some trials that actually look to see, if there is disease. And this is very fascinating. I come from a family. My mother has RA, my grandmother has psoriatic arthritis. So I've been able to grow up and see the firsthand. And sometimes I often have thought for myself, we know that autoimmune disease can have a genetic predisposition. And then sometimes, in especially rheumatoid arthritis, you could have subclinical or preclinical disease. So this is Stop RA. It's a trial. It's the very first clinical prevention trial, a research study for rheumatoid arthritis conducted in the United States. And Dr. Kevin Dean, he's PhD, Associate Professor of Rheumatology at the University of Colorado in Denver School of Medicine, is conducting this across the country. And we know right now there's currently a large range of medicines used to treat rheumatoid arthritis, but not any proven ways to prevent RA. So Stop RA is studying medications. One is hydroxychloroquine to see if it can prevent RA of these people that are in the subclinical or preclinical stages that have a high level of what's called an anti-CCP positive blood antibody. They don't have the synovitis. They don't have the diagnosis of RA. They might have been to the orthopedist and had one joint that was hurting and evaluated, and then maybe another, but nothing that's going to give them that diagnosis. And what this does with the study is they're interested in looking at family members even of people that have RA and being able to test them. So if you're interested, you can go to stoprA.org, tell your family members or your friends, and there's just a lot of wealth of information there as well to give you that information on participating in trials on that end of the study. I was impressed when I learned about this. There are other drugs besides hydroxychloroquine that are being studied. Rituxan has been looked at as well to potentially delay the onset of RA for a year. So this covers that part of the study as well. So I chose that for RA. The next slide is actually Sjogren's syndrome, which is quite prevalent. We know as a background, it's a systemic disease, autoimmune, affecting the quality of life, characterized by dry eyes, dry mouth, inflammatory arthritis, but being systemic can also pretty much affect pulmonary, neurologic, and even lymphoma associations, and there's no cure. We don't hear as much about Sjogren's syndrome, I feel, mainly because there's not been a lot of studies out there in the past. Well, this has really stepped up, and now there's looking at 25 biologics, small molecules that are being investigated, and we're about to see over the next 3 to 5 years a lot more drugs come out that are going to be approved for Sjogren's syndrome, if not some of these more systemic associations that are severe that there's no cure for. Recently, just passed phase 2 studies, some combination studies with hydroxychloroquine and leflunomide, some combination studies with rituximab and belimumab, and then getting into the anti-CD40 antibody iscalimab, and the receptor inhibitor B-cell depletion agent ianalumab. So some of these, they're made public. You can look at those. If you have family members as well with Sjogren's, that can also be difficult to treat. So I thought that was really exciting, that something that patients haven't had access to in quite some time. Now we're going to be seeing that over the next few years, which is going to be very exciting to follow and monitor as well. And then finally, the next and the last group that I chose on the next slide, systemic lupus erythematosus. We know that certainly there have been a lot of slides. It's been a very exciting year for lupus patients with new FDA approved therapies. But what is still in that pipeline? What can we still get excited about a little bit? Biogen has a global phase 3 called Topaz-1. It's a 52-week multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled phase 3 study, and it's evaluating efficacy and safety, as we talked about earlier about clinical trials, of their drug in adult participants with active systemic lupus erythematosus that are receiving background non-biologic lupus and standard of care. So again, we talked about the standard of care double-blind placebo studies. So this phase 3 follows a very positive phase 2 study of this drug that was called the LILAC study. And that LILAC study in the phase 2 stages looked at the efficacy results that supported the further evaluation. It met primary endpoints that did demonstrate statistically significant reduction of disease activity in patients with lupus. Majority of adverse events were mild to moderate. So this is a first-in-class humanized IgG1 monoclonal antibody that's going to target dendritic cell antigen 2 compared to placebo. Again, exciting. It's already shown some efficacy, safety. So we will all be able to look forward to this global phase 3 Topaz-1 52-week study. There's actually 15 sites worldwide, targeted enrollment of around 540 adults with active lupus. We talked about earlier in those phases of lupus. When you get to phase 3, you're looking at having a broader range of patients being able to be enrolled, and also diversity of patients as well. This enrollment is going to target to reflect the prevalence of lupus in African American, Hispanic, Latinx communities, with the aim to achieve appropriate representation in this study as well. The one thing with this study, and we'll all have to keep our eyes open as well, is will they increase that enrollment, because we know that in phase 3 trials, that goal is to increase populations. The one thing with the study, these patients have not been able to use a background biologic. So that would potentially eliminate some of the patients for availability for this study if they had been treated with a biologic. So a little bit more of those clinical pearls that we learn about. The primary objective of Topaz-1 is to demonstrate the reduction in the disease activity as measured with the primary endpoint. So the primary endpoint of control of disease activity. So still, even though we've had an excellent year with new medications approved for lupus, we still have some right there in the pipeline with a lot of excitement as well. This is the end of my part, and I appreciate everybody being here. I hope that if you've participated in trials, you continue. If you haven't, you feel a lot more comfortable talking with your rheumatologist, friends or family, and be able to have that access. Now I'm excited to introduce Kelly Owens, and for us all to be able to listen to her personal experience with her clinical trial. Kelly?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me, Wendy. That was such a fantastic presentation. You set up that the idea of clinical trials so beautifully and went over that so thoroughly. So thank you for a wonderful presentation, and to the previous panelists that were on before. You did absolutely beautifully. So thank you so much for having me here today. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kelly Owens, and I'm really excited to be here today. I'm the Director of Education at the Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research. But today I will be speaking from the patient perspective about my experience participating in a clinical trial for vagus nerve stimulation for Crohn's disease and inflammatory arthritis. Let's see. Now, if I can figure out how to advance, there we go. All right. So humanity has been enraptured by electricity for millennia. The ancient Greeks used electric rays, a type of fish, to treat gout and numb the pain of childbirth and operations. Equally intrigued, the ancient Egyptians stood on electric rays to control pain. In 1855, Walt Whitman wrote "I Sing the Body Electric." And then in 1899, Tesla found that the earth was, quote, literally alive with electrical vibrations. If you want to find the secrets of the universe, he said, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. Now, bioelectronic medicine is treating disease using electricity. So before I go into talking about my personal experience in a clinical trial of participating in bioelectronic medicine and getting a vagus nerve stimulator, let's first talk a little bit about what bioelectronic medicine actually is. Bioelectronic medicine represents a convergence of molecular medicine, neuroscience, and bioengineering. Its central idea is that injury and illness can be treated by carefully targeting the nervous system using devices. Rather than suppressing the patient's immune system using biologics and immunosuppressants, instead, by modulating the brain's inflammatory signals traveling through the nervous system to the spleen and other organs, bioelectronic medicine allows the body to achieve homeostasis when inflammation goes into overdrive. At the height of the COVID-19 pandemic that we all have just experienced over the last 18 months, there was a lot of talk about cytokine storms. That's the exact same thing as the body's inflammatory reflex over-responding to disease and injury and going off the rails. And that is what bioelectronic medicine seeks to control and set right. So in a way, I'm living proof that it is possible to control inflammation and cure disease by modulating the nervous system. But first, let me tell you my personal story. I suffered from Crohn's disease and inflammatory arthritis for 15 years before I entered a clinical trial to test a bioelectronic medicine device 4 years ago. Over the course of those 15 years of battling inflammation, I dealt with colitis flares that left me doubled over in pain, dehydrated, and malnourished, sometimes only able to be nourished by a PICC line in my arm. Inflammatory arthritis spread from my ankle to every other joint in my body, and I ended up with 2 pyodermas on my legs that took 18 months each to heal. I was prescribed 22 different biologics and immunosuppressants over those 15 years, all of which failed, leaving me battling active disease from the time I was 13 until I was 28. I was hospitalized half a dozen times and spent more than 100 days and nights in the emergency room. Sometimes I needed a cane to get around. After long periods of immobility, I needed a walker to regain balance. And at my worst, I relied on a wheelchair. But while all of this was going on in my life, Dr. Kevin Tracy and his team were conducting research that would change my life. First, by participating in identifying TNF as the key accelerant of inflammation, and then helping to develop monoclonal anti-TNF to modulate inflammation, which led to an entirely new class of drugs beginning in the 80s, including Remicade, Enbrel, Humira, and all of the drugs that we all know very well here today. But this work actually led to 2 more major discoveries, and that was classifying the phenomenon of the body reacting and then overreacting to insult and injury in what is now known as the inflammatory reflex, and discovering that the vagus nerve is its mechanism. Dr. Tracy has since proven and elucidated this discovery by demonstrating that by electrically stimulating the vagus nerve, the overproduction of inflammation can be effectively turned off in the immune system without side effects. And this, thankfully, is what happened to me. I first learned about bioelectronic medicine and vagus nerve stimulation in 2014, and that was after seeing Dr. Tracy's interview with the Huffington Post, where he was talking about this tiny device that uses electrons to treat inflammatory diseases. At the time, he shared that it was going to be tested in rheumatoid arthritis with this company called Setpoint Medical. And he wrote this article at the time as well called The Body Electric. And as I watched his interview that night with my legs propped up and, on pillows and ice packs on my knees, I felt this sense of hope for the first time in so long, because I knew that this would help me too, because it seemed to me that while drugs negotiated with the body, it seemed to me that vagus nerve stimulation seemed to command it. However, a clinical trial didn't become available for Crohn's disease until 2017, which was 3 years later. And over the course of those 3 years, my health further deteriorated. And then in 2017, when I learned that Setpoint Medical was conducting a clinical trial for Crohn's disease and that it was taking place in the Netherlands, my husband and I sold everything that we owned and we spent 6 months living abroad. And of course, that's a huge jump to take. And so we really had to evaluate what our risks were here. And the two biggest ones that popped up for me was, number one, how would we financially swing living in Europe for 6 months? And two, this was my first ever surgery, and I seemed to be jumping in the deep end a little bit. But with the support of our family and friends, we were able to crowdfund enough to keep us afloat. And my second concern regarding surgery was quieted very quickly by the realization that I had two options here. I could take a risk and have some short-term surgical discomfort, but get this device that could change my life, or I could stay as I was, which was in constant chronic pain, reliant on mobility devices when I couldn't walk and PICC lines when I couldn't eat. I already knew what life looked like if I chose the latter, but I yearned for how great I knew it could be otherwise. So we took the leap. On June 22nd, 2017, a small electrode was implanted in my neck, wrapped around my vagus nerve. Powered by a small magnet, that implant stimulates my vagus nerve, turning off the overproduction of inflammation in the immune system. When my device is active, it sends an electrical signal from my vagus nerve to my spleen. There, that electrical signal becomes a chemical. A neurotransmitter called neuroepinephrine interacts with T cells in the spleen, and then that releases acetylcholine, which is another neurotransmitter. At that point, the acetylcholine travels to the macrophages, which are white blood cells, and tells the macrophages to turn off the overproduction of inflammation. And it did so, which was incredible. And within days of my device being turned on, my pain decreased significantly. Within weeks, my joint swelling did as well. And 2 months later, I was deemed in remission for the first time since my diagnosis, nearly 16 years prior. This is one of my favorite quotes nowadays. And Mark Twain, I found it recently and I just love it. He once wrote that life would be infinitely happier if we could only be born at the age of 80 and gradually approach 18. For those wondering what it feels like to have a bioelectronic medicine device as a treatment for Crohn's and inflammatory arthritis, this is exactly what it has felt like for me. I call it the Benjamin Button effect. It's been 4 years since my surgery, and life looks nothing like it did before. Prior to vagus nerve stimulation, I had to think about the movements that it would take to button a shirt, brush my hair, and wash a dish. Nowadays, it's very difficult for me to imagine where I would be without this revolutionary field of medicine. Here you will see our recent trip back to Hawaii, which is where we were living when I first learned about bioelectronic medicine in 2014. When we lived there, I didn't get to experience island life the way that my husband and our friends did because of my disease. I was literally unable to see the full scope of the beauty of this world because of my limitations due to inflammation. But returning there in July for a friend's wedding, I set out to conquer my mountains. The panorama picture is of me looking out at Hanauma Bay from the bottom of a very steep rock ridge that I did not tell my mother that I was going to climb down before I did it. And the bottom right picture is of me looking back down at that same bay from the top of Cocoa Head, which is 1,000 railroad ties up to the top. At the top of each hike, on each mountain, my husband, Sean, who has seen me through this for 16 years now, made it a tradition to ask me what I thought at the top. Cocoa Head was the last hike of our trip, and it was my Everest. And the magnitude of seeing that panoramic view, oh, sorry, it gets me emotional, left me very overwhelmed.
What do you think?
That video gets me every time. And then there's another one that of my husband that he talks about what it was like to be up there and see me climbing. And I can't wait until more patients experience that. So, pulling it together. Denzel Washington, the great Denzel Washington, I should say, once said, to get something you never had, you have to try something you never did. And I have found that to be true in my experience. Patients who participate in clinical research have a direct impact on advancing the future of healthcare by evaluating the efficacy of novel therapeutics with the hope that if that therapy is found effective, future patients won't have to endure the pain that we all have. And hopefully the patient's own life will be drastically changed for the better, as has been the case for me and so many other patients who have participated in clinical research. However, choosing to participate in a clinical trial is a deeply personal decision that must include the patient's evaluation of the risk-benefit ratio and an evaluation of the prior research. What are the grounds of this trial founded on? Who developed the trial and contributed to the research, and what is their area of expertise and track record in their respective fields? What's the best that can happen, and what's the worst that can happen? And what will happen if I choose not to participate at all? These are all questions that I evaluated when I made the decision to enroll in a clinical trial testing the efficacy of vagus nerve stimulation. It was very important to me that I understood the field of which I was entering so that I could make the most informed decision possible. And I have made it my life's work since to understand that field as well as a non-scientist can. So in 1900, Lord Kelvin announced at the British Association of Science that, quote, "There is nothing new to be discovered in physics now. All that remains is more and more precise measurement." Meanwhile, in Zurich, Einstein was working out his theory of relativity and space-time. The idea that humanity has reached its peak follows each generation, yet progress prevails. And it does so because of all of you, the chronically relentless, seeking answers, demanding results. Don't give up. Thank you so much for having me today. It was a delight to participate in this breakout session.